when I make the simple request that they stop praying before the meetings, they don't bother to listen.
Well, since we haven't been to a meeting in a while, maybe they've stopped those prayers before the meeting. So we'll just go in, we'll sit down, and when they open the floor to the public, you'll say your piece, and then afterwards we can leave and maybe get something to eat or some coffee.
Yeah, it's been a year or so since I said anything about the prayers, so I really hope you're right.
The roll call having been completed and the Pledge of Allegiance having been said, we will now have an opening prayer from Reverend Micah Chapel from Galloway Church. Reverend Chapel.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. If you would all please join me as you are led. Almighty Father, we come here today.
Again, why do they need to pray before the meetings? They honestly don't need to. Are they even allowed to anyways? I think the church is getting way too involved with our government.
Right, when they have a minister come and expect all of us to pray, the town members turn citizens like you and I into nothing more than second-class afterthoughts.
Well, I know at one point the Lord was letting persons of any faith to come and pray before the meetings, but that pattern has hardly lasted for long.
I think it's time we do something about this. If the town board won't accommodate, let alone listen to us, let's make some phone calls and get the higher authorities involved.
For tonight's story, two women from Greece, New York, are speaking out against the town's incessant Christian prayers before town hall meetings. Susan Galloway and Linda Stevens had originally pleaded to the Greece Town Board for giving Christianity too much of an influence over the public circle, which in turn they believed was overstepping the Establishment Clause. JR?
Thanks, Brendan. The Establishment Clause is located in the First Amendment to the Constitution, and it states that the government may not make any law that respects an establishment of religion, nor can it conduct an action that favors one religion over another. While this clause may seem like a short and simple part of a much larger constitution, politicians and people's groups have argued over the words and their meanings for over 200 years. As the legal dispute between prayer and government continues, we are joined in the studio tonight by Susan Galloway, Linda Stevens, and their lawyer Douglas Laycock, who have brought their suit against the city of Greece. Welcome to our broadcast.
Thanks
Thank
for
you for
having me.
having us.
So tell me, how do you feel the case is progressing?
I have no idea what to tell you. As you already know, the town majority decision was given in the district court. But then when we took the case to the higher court of appeals, the judges decided in our favor.
So we thought that everything was over at that time.
But now the town of Greece convinced the Supreme Court to issue a writ of
certiorari. They issued a writ of certiorari.
and now the case is going to be concluded for the second time.
And Greece isn't going to rest until they have this decision in their favor.
And how does that make you feel?
Well, I understand that this is good, that we're starting important conversations and we're getting a lot of publicity, but it just shows that we are far from over.
Well, I would like to add that we do feel there's a positive side to this. Having this hearing isn't necessarily going to set us back, but it may give us an even louder national voice on this issue of prayer. And I intend to use another case that's related to this to help use it to our advantage, and that's Marsh versus Chambers.
Could you explain to us a little bit more about that case?
Certainly. So Marsh versus Chambers was a Supreme Court case that decided whether Nebraska's state legislature was allowed to have a chaplain lead the state governing body in prayer. The court ruled that the state was allowed to continue the prayers, but in doing so, the decision set up the reasonable observer test to determine if legislative prayer constitutes an unallowable endorsement of religion.
But if that decision was made for the state government, where does that sit with the local town hall meetings?
Well, that's exactly what I was getting to, because I believe we can use Marsh versus Chambers to show that this is a different case altogether. If the justices can see that prayers at town hall meetings that directly address and impact citizens of our local community are really coercive and divisive, then I believe that we can use that in our favor and for our advantage to show that this is not something we want to do.
Mr. Laycock, I really hope that you can convey that to the court.
I want to thank our guests for being here this evening. It looks as if your case is far from over.
Thanks for having us.
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. The Supreme Court of the United States of America is now in session. God save these United States and this honorable court.
This morning we will hear a case of Town of Greece versus Galloway. On behalf of the petitioner, we will start Mr. Hungar.
I'm more interested in how far that you're able to stretch the historical argument. For example, our motto is, "In God we trust." That is correct, right?
That is correct, sir.
So would adopting this motto be all right today? For example, we do not require that each city in every state take a cross out of their seals, but that doesn't mean that it would be allowed today.
Not exactly, but I think history is essential in understanding the Establishment Clause and its application. This is for two main reasons. First of all, the practice of legislative prayer and the motto of "In God We Trust" has yet to lead to an establishment
I must refer to God by his name. What do we do with this? We can recommend it, but can we say that the Constitution of the United States requires it?
If you really believe that the government can't draw lines here, then your alternative is either prohibit prayer entirely or permit absolutely anything.
Suppose you did this. You combine your two approaches. The town has to make a good faith effort to appeal to all certain types of faiths. But then you have these words from the House. The chaplain should keep in mind that the House of Representatives, or you would say whatever relative body, is comprised of many different faiths and traditions. Period. End of matter. Is that sufficient, these two things?
That would help immensely, Your Honor. We think that some of the clergy might need a more detailed explanation of what that exactly means, but that would help immensely. The government became very heavily involved in religion when we decided there to be prayers to open legislative session. And March is that source of government involvement in religion. And now the question is, how do we manage the problems that arise from that?
Well, March is not the source of government involvement in religion in this respect. The first Congress is the source.
Fair enough, the tradition to which March points.
The first Congress that also adopted the First Amendment.
That's correct, but that did not have prayer that addressed predestination or having to accept Jesus as your Savior, or at any point in which listeners could disagree.
My understanding is that the first chaplain of the Senate was the Episcopal Bishop of New York. Isn't that right? He took his prayers from the Book of Common Prayer. Do you think that was acceptable to Baptists at the time or to Quakers?
Well, it wouldn't have been their choice, Your Honor, but they talk about the choice between bishops and presbyters and congregations governing the church. They have not offered a single example of a prayer on the founding era that addressed points on which Protestants were known to disagree. And I don't think there is one, Your Honor. The founding generation kept government out of religious disagreements. And what has not changed is the principle, but what has changed is that we now have a wider range of religious disagreements today. If there are no further questions, we ask you to affirm.
Thank you, Mr. Laycock. Case is submitted.
Tonight, we further explore the case of Town of Greece versus Galloway as we look more in depth at the arguments that were presented yesterday morning. To further explain the recent events, we have Andrew Stanko live on the scene of the steps by the Supreme Court. Andy?
Thank you, Brendan. A few things need to be understood about the oral arguments that just occurred. None of the lawyers or the justices wanted to create a religious-free zone, as some may call it. It's fair to acknowledge that this case isn't about whether or not you can have prayers before these town hall meetings, but rather what types of prayers you can have before these town hall sessions.
Andy, any thoughts on Thomas Hunger's arguments on behalf of Greece before the Supreme Court?
Well, JR, Mr. Hunger was in the beginning caught in between a crossfire of hypothetical questions between Justices Kagan and Alito. At first, Justice Kagan wanted to see just how far Mr. Hunger would approve of explicit Christian prayer in all sorts of different government meetings. But by the end, we also see Justice Alito asking Mr. Laycock, all right then, if we are going to continue to allow these prayers before meetings, but have them filtered, give me a concrete example of a prayer that appeals to all religions. Give me substance.
Now, what about Justice Kennedy's comment on Mr. Hunger's historical argument?
Well, Justice Kennedy seems to be the tipping point in this case. He did comment that Mr. Hunger begins and ends with the historical argument, but also noted that having government officials screen and review prayers before they are given would result in heavy government censorship. And no one's really asking for that. But where do we find that balance? That will be up to the majority opinion.
Now, in regard of finding a balance in the Establishment Clause, any comments on Justice Breyer's suggestion of acknowledging the many faiths?
Well, Justice Breyer's suggestion seems like it's a compromise that would appeal to a large majority. But then again, making a statement such as his own before one of these town hall meetings could only be seen as a short-term fix, because this issue of legislative prayer is controversial enough to make it all the way up to the highest court in the United States.
Well, Andy, we thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to hearing from you after the court opinions.
Next case on the docket is number 12696, Town of Greece versus Galloway et al. Justice Kennedy will deliver the opinion of the court.
The court must decide whether the town of Greece, New York imposes an impermissible establishment of religion by opening its monthly board meetings with prayer. As we stated in our 1983 Marsh v. Chambers opinion, in light of the unambiguous and unbroken history of more than 200 invites prayer into the public sphere, government must permit a prayer giver to address his or her own God or gods as conscience dictates, unfettered by what a judge considers non-sectarian. The town of Greece does not violate the First Amendment by opening its meetings with prayer that comports with our tradition and does not coerce participation by non-adherents. The judgment of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit is reversed.
Justices Alito and Scalia.
Thank you, Chief Justice Roberts. In forming my decision, I examined the narrow aspect of the principal dissent, only to find that the principal dissent's objection in the end is very upsetting. The principal dissent writes as follows: if the town board had let its chaplains know that they should speak in terms common to diverse religious groups, then no one would have valid grounds for complaint. Priests, ministers, rabbis, and imams give such invocations all the time without any great difficulty. Both houses of Congress now advise guest chaplains to keep in mind that they are addressing members from a variety of faith traditions, and this advice works as a matter of policy. But any argument that non-sectarian prayer is constitutionally required runs head-on into a long history of contrary congressional practice. From the beginning, many Christian prayers were offered in the House and Senate, and when rabbis and other non-Christian clergy have served as guest chaplains, their prayers have often been couched in terms particular to their faith traditions.
If a town attempts to go beyond simply giving advice to a minister of some sort, the town will inevitably encounter sensitive problems. Should a town have to screen and edit prayers before they are given? If a guest minister crosses the line, what must the town do? Should the minister be corrected on the spot? Must the town strike its chaplain from the approved list? I am troubled by the message that some readers may take in the dissent's rhetoric and its highly unlikely hypothetical situations. For example, the principal dissent makes up the image of an official at a polling place who makes citizens make the sign of the cross before casting their ballots. Although I do not suggest that the implication is intentional, I am concerned that at least some readers will take such hypotheticals as a warning that this is where today's decision leads, to a country in which religious minorities are denied the equal benefits of citizenship. Nothing could be further from the truth. All the court does today is to allow a town to follow a practice that we previously held as permissible for Congress and for state legislatures. In seeming to suggest otherwise, the principal dissent goes far astray.
On the dissenting side, Justice Kagan.
Thank you, Chief Justice. On behalf of myself and the other dissenters of this case, Justice Ginsburg, Justice Breyer, and Justice Sotomayor, we respectfully dissent from this court's opinion because we think the town of Greece's prayer practices violate the norm of religious equality. I do not contend that principle translates here into a bright separationist line. To the contrary, I agree with this court's decision in Marsh versus Chambers back in 1983, which upheld the Nebraska legislature's tradition of beginning each session with a chaplain's prayer.
I believe that inclusion in a town hall setting can satisfy the constitutional requirement of neutrality, as such a forum need not become a religion-free zone. But still, the town of Greece should lose this case. The practice at issue here differs from the one sustained in Marsh because Greece's town meetings involve participation by ordinary citizens, and the invocations given directly to those citizens were predominantly sectarian and common. For month in and month out, for over a decade, steeped only in one faith, prayers addressed toward members of the public commenced meetings to discuss local affairs and distribute government benefits. In my view, this practice does not square with the First Amendment.
In both Greece's and the majority's view, everything discussed is irrelevant because this case involves the tradition of legislative prayer. They are right that under the Marsh decision, legislative prayer has a distinctive constitutional warrant by virtue of tradition.
And there you have it with the decision, with the Supreme Court deciding 5-4 in favor of Town of Greece. While we are able to present highlights of the decisions, Andrew Stanko is back again in front of the Supreme Court to answer some questions. Andy, would you mind telling us what some of the remaining justices had to say?
Well, to paraphrase Justice Kennedy, Kennedy added that sectarian prayers were permissible on the basis that ministers of different faiths were drawn in from the surrounding population of Greece, New York. Kennedy also brought forth the distinction between coercion and offense of citizens by prayer before these meetings. Justice Kennedy felt that offense was not grounds for violating the Establishment Clause.
But didn't Justices Scalia and Thomas refuse to join Kennedy in that part of the opinion?
Yes, that is correct. Justice Scalia and Thomas both voted in the majority for sectarian prayer, but both felt that only legal coercion would be a violation of the Establishment Clause, and that peer pressure alone would not be enough to be considered a violation.
And although Justice Scalia brought forth his concurring opinion, we also received news that Justice Thomas obscurely had to deal with that opinion that the Establishment Clause was to only be applied to the federal government and not the state or local governments.
Yes, that is correct. He did raise an interesting point that has yet to lead to a response.
Now how about Justice Kagan and her dissenting opinion?
Justice Kagan's dissent was both specific and vague at the same time. On one hand, she suggested that the town could have found more diverse prayer givers from different religious groups around the area. But on the other hand, she also wrote that the First Amendment guarantees that every citizen, regardless of religion, owns an equal share in his or her government.
Thank you for your time, Andy. Now, if you don't mind, and please closing us out.
Thank you. As you all have witnessed today, Linda Stevens and Susan Galloway appealed before the courts because they felt that their town of Greece was favoring one religion over another. And as a result, their local government was violating the Establishment Clause, which prohibits government from making any law respecting the establishment of religion. The prayers
being said before the court were conducted by ordained ministers, thus creating an environment that was centered around one religion, which excluded those of different beliefs or no beliefs at all.
The lines of separation between church and state are continually trying to be defined by lawyers, judges, government officials, and courts. What we need to remember is that just as Susan Galloway and Linda Stevens did, we the people decide on legislation and appealing issues that we feel need to be challenged.
The documents that our country's foundation is vested upon are centralized around the idea that power always comes back to the people. The government's power derives from the consent of the governed. Thus, the government's power derives from Galloway, Stevens, you and me.
The balance of power is delicate, but through checks and balances, the Constitution is appointed to keep legislation in order for both the government's decisions and the people's protests.
The First Amendment states that Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Our government does not favor one religion because our religion is a liberty. It is a freedom that an established institution cannot ethically or morally interfere, control, or attempt to regulate. With that in mind, it also does not have the levity to completely inhibit it either.
The city of Greece, New York continues to pray. What is considered right and wrong is up for debate, and the law is never final. With this in mind, you, the citizen, decide what you will fight for.
The Constitution has been set up as a boundary to protect our rights as citizens, but it is our responsibility to uphold and enforce the amendments. Trying to create a religion-free country would create as much unconstitutional hostility as creating a country completely engulfed around a religion would.
As citizens, it is our duty to uphold the Constitution and influence how and why what government enacts. Together, we form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity.